What would you do if the man you cared for like a father left you his entire fortune while his real children sat across the room and called you a thief? On the edge of Brambleton Avenue in Norfolk, Virginia, stood a house nobody noticed. The paint had long surrendered to weather and time. The mailbox leaned forward like a broken jaw. The porch steps groaned whenever someone dared climb them, as if they were whispering secrets too old to matter. It wasn't abandoned. It just looked like it had given up. People passed by every day. Joggers, mailmen, mothers with strollers. Not one of them gave the place a second glance. Except her. Every morning at precisely 6:35, a tall black woman in plain shoes and a navy cardigan would walk up those creaky steps with quiet purpose. Her name was Ruth Delaney, but no one around here ever used it. To most, she was just the caregiver, the maid, the help. She didn't correct them. At 51, Ruth had mastered the art of being invisible. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. She moved like someone who'd spent her whole life trying not to take up too much space, but there was steel under her softness. Sharp when she needed to be, solid when others crumbled. For 21 years, Ruth had taken care of Mr. Everett Langston, the man who lived in the house nobody noticed. She'd been with him through 2 knee replacements, insulin shots, endless pills, 3 heart surgeries, and now cancer. She fed him, bathed him, changed his sheets. She laughed with him when he was strong enough to joke. She sat beside him in silence when the pain spoke louder than either of them could. And still, people whispered, "She's probably waiting for him to die and leave her something. Bet she's got her eye on that house. Black woman in a rich white man's house? Yeah, right." Ruth heard it all. At the grocery store, in line at the pharmacy, even from other caregivers who didn't last a month. But she didn't flinch. She just kept showing up, because this wasn't just a job to her. It had never been. Everett Langston had once been the kind of name that carried weight, quiet wealth, made in the back rooms of tech startups and medical companies in the late 80s. By the time he retired in 99, his portfolio was worth millions. But wealth doesn't keep you warm at night. And it certainly doesn't heal the wounds you refuse to name. Everett had outlived most of his friends, outlasted 2 financial crises, and outdrank the grief of losing his wife, Rose, to breast cancer. What he didn't outlive was the silence that came after. 4 children, gone. Not one birthday call, not one Christmas visit. Not even a postcard. They blamed him, said he moved on too fast. Said he drank too much, said he dishonored their mother by sleeping around. But Ruth saw through the bitterness. She'd been there when he woke up screaming her name, Rose. She saw the way he paused when someone said family. It wasn't hard to care for him. What was hard was watching the world forget he ever mattered. She met him when she was 30, newly divorced, looking for steady work. He was her first client. "He's mean," the agency warned. "He'll fire you in a week," he tried. He yelled, he cursed, he barked orders like she was furniture. Ruth didn't budge. She saw what no one else saw. A man drowning quietly, choking on regret and rage, and years of not knowing how to ask for help. She stayed. And day by day, Everett softened. He never said thank you, not in words. But he remembered her birthday. He left the porch light on when she worked late. He sat up straighter when she walked into the room. That was his way, and it was enough. Outside that crumbling house, people judged. But inside, something tender grew. Not love in the romantic sense, not lust or fairy tale rescues. Just loyalty, mutual dignity, the kind of bond you don't find in movies or novels. Only in the quiet moments no one sees. Then came the diagnosis. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months if he was lucky. He wasn't. It spread like fire in dry grass. Within weeks, He couldn't walk. Within days, he could barely speak. But one night, as she tucked his blanket around his legs, Everett looked at her and said, "I don't got much time." She said nothing, just nodded. "I don't want to leave this world without setting things right." Ruth's hands paused. He reached out, weak but steady. "I want to marry you." She blinked, thought he was joking. "I'm not talking about love," he said. "I'm talking about honor. You've been more family than any of them ever were. They left me." "You stayed. You deserve my name, my house, everything I've got left." Her heart was pounding, her voice barely above a whisper. "People already think I'm stealing from you. Let them." Before the house got quiet, it used to breathe with life. The Langston children, Eric, Vanessa, Derek, and Claire once, ran through the halls barefoot, shouting over each other, chasing laughter down polished wood floors. Their mother, Rose, made everything feel warm. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and clove. The front yard was full of chalk drawings and scooters. And Everett smiled back then. He wasn't soft, but he was present. He'd come home from his investment meetings, roll up his sleeves, and fix leaky faucets with one hand while holding a baby with the other. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and then Rose got sick. The diagnosis hit like a silent bomb: breast cancer, late stage. For months, Everett flew her to every specialist across the country. They tried everything: radiation, holistic regimens, private clinics. But nothing worked, and when she died, something inside Everett did too. At the funeral, he barely spoke. He stood next to the casket like it wasn't real. Claire reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Vanessa sobbed. Eric clenched his jaw. Derek stared at the grass like he could disappear into it, and Everett just shut down. The grief didn't make him gentle. It made him bitter, cold, cruel even. He barked at his children for crying, told them to man up or stop being dramatic. He slammed doors, ignored birthdays, started drinking. At first they tried. Claire brought him casseroles. Vanessa called every night. Derek mowed the lawn without being asked. But Everett didn't say thank you. Didn't say anything, really. One night, when Claire brought him a photo album Rose had made, he snapped, "She's dead. Stop acting like your pity makes up for it." Claire left in tears. The others followed. That was the last time any of them saw him for over 30 years. Everett never spoke of it again. If asked, he'd say, "They abandoned me." If pressed, he'd say, "They never understood." But Ruth knew better. She saw the way he lingered over old photos, the way his voice cracked when he thought no one was listening, the way he flinched when the doorbell rang, hoping, just hoping, it was one of them. It never was. He buried himself in work for a while, built wealth quietly, invested early in biotech startups and clean energy companies before the rest of the world caught on. He never bragged, didn't flash money. But the money grew. By the time he turned 65, Everett had a net worth most only dream of: offshore accounts, property in 3 states, and stock portfolios that made analysts drool. But wealth has no warmth. At night, Everett sat in his worn armchair, the TV flickering on mute, a drink in his hand and silence louder than any voice. Ruth started noticing the small things, the way he held the edge of the table when standing, the way he forgot what day it was, the tremble in his hands when pouring coffee. She never asked what was wrong. He never offered. That was their unspoken agreement. No pity. No preaching. Just presence. Then came the fall. It wasn't dramatic, just a slip in the hallway, but it changed everything. The scans revealed cancer already spread too far. The doctor's voice was clinical. "Pancreatic, stage 4, maybe 3 months. Everett didn't flinch. He just nodded, then asked to be left alone. But when the nurse left the room, Everett turned to Ruth. "Don't tell them," he said. "They won't care." Ruth didn't answer, because she wasn't so sure he was wrong. Over the next few weeks, he declined fast. The man who once played chess in the study now struggled to lift a spoon. Ruth adapted. She always did. She rearranged furniture so he wouldn't trip. She set alarms for medications. She bought him new slippers when the old ones lost grip. Still, she never overstepped, never called his kids, never opened old wounds. Until one night when he couldn't sleep, he asked her to sit. "I ruined it," he said. "Ruined what?" she asked. "All of it. The family, the love, the chance to be forgiven." His voice was barely a whisper. "Rose would be ashamed of me." Ruth didn't say he was wrong. She didn't lie to make him feel better. She just reached over, took his hand, and held it. Because sometimes the only answer grief wants is silence that doesn't leave. Everett spent his last weeks trying to make sense of the mess he had made. He gave Ruth access to every bank account. He called Marla Green, his longtime attorney. He rewrote his will. He didn't do it out of revenge, not out of spite. He did it because Ruth had done what no one else would. She stayed. She wiped his mouth when he was too weak to chew. She changed his clothes when he soiled himself. She watched him cry without looking away. And somewhere in the middle of all that pain, Everett finally understood loyalty isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when the lights go out. By the time Ruth had worked for Mr. Everett Langston for 6 months, she already knew his entire routine. Coffee at 7 o'clock a.m., exactly 2 sugars, no cream. Talk radio, volume low. Medication lined up like little soldiers beside his breakfast plate. He never said thank you. Never asked how she was, just nodded when she entered, grunted when she left. Most people would have taken the hint. Left for a better job, a warmer home, a less miserable man. Ruth didn't. Not because she liked him. At least, not at first. But because she recognized the grief. Ruth had been through her own storm. A 10-year marriage to a man who started sweet and turned cruel. By the end, his words left bruises deeper than his hands ever did. She left with nothing but a suitcase, a worn-out Bible, and a resume no one cared about. The home care agency had been her last hope. Everett Langston was her first assignment. "He goes through caregivers like tissues," the coordinator warned. "Doesn't talk, doesn't tip, doesn't want company." Ruth didn't need him to want her there. She just needed a paycheck. But what she found was something else entirely. Everett was harsh, yes. But underneath the gruffness was something more fragile, loneliness. Ruth could see it in the way he stared at the framed photos of his wife, Rose, longer than necessary. In the way he lingered at the hallway mirror, adjusting a tie he didn't need to wear anymore. In the way he left the porch light on at night, even when no one was expected. Grief had hollowed him out, hollowed him. And he had built walls so high, even his children couldn't climb them. But Ruth didn't try to tear those walls down. She just kept showing up. Every day, she brought him more than food and medication. She brought rhythm. She refilled the bird feeder because she noticed he liked watching cardinals. She hummed old jazz tunes while sweeping, just loud enough for him to catch. She never asked him to open up. But slowly, he did. One morning, Ruth came in to find Everett sitting at the kitchen table, the newspaper folded in front of him but unread. Without looking up, he said, "You're late." She wasn't. She was right on time. But she smiled anyway. "No, sir, you're early." And for the first time in months, he chuckled. Just once, but it was real. From then on, things shifted. He started waiting by the window for her arrival. He made a second cup of coffee in the mornings black, just the way she liked it. And one day, when she forgot her umbrella, he handed her his late wife's old one without a word. It wasn't romance, not the kind with flowers and candlelight. It was something quieter, older, built slowly, like ivy climbing a forgotten wall. Years passed. And while Everett's body continued to fail him, his spirit slowly warmed. Ruth became more than his caregiver. She was the only one who remembered his birthday. The one who noticed when he was in pain before he said a word. The one who adjusted the thermostat without being asked, because she knew the cold made his knees ache. She became the person who reminded him he was still human. Of course, the neighbors noticed. Small-town gossip is louder than church bells. They whispered, "She's probably got him under a spell. Bet she's already picked out drapes for when he dies. Black woman, white millionaire, you do the math." Ruth heard it all. And ignored it all. She wasn't there for what he had, she was there for who he was. Or at least, who he was trying to become again. One evening, after a particularly rough chemo session, Everett sat in the garden wrapped in a blanket. Ruth sat beside him, silent. The late sunlight cast long shadows. The wind carried the scent of rosemary and regret. He looked at her, pale but clear-eyed. "You know what I miss most?" he said. She looked up. "Sunday dinners." The noise. Rose's peach cobbler. The kids bickering over who got the last biscuit. He paused. "I don't even remember what I said that pushed them all away, but I know it was awful." Ruth didn't try to fix it. Didn't offer forgiveness that wasn't hers to give. She just said, "You're not the only one who's made mistakes." And for a while, they just sat there. Two people who had both lost more than they ever admitted. That night, as she helped him into bed, Everett grabbed her hand. Not tightly, just enough to make her stop. "Ruth," he said, his voice ragged, "if I had met you years ago, maybe I wouldn't have ruined so much." She didn't answer. Because what do you say to a man who's trying to rewrite his legacy at the edge of death? So she kissed his forehead gently and whispered, "You're here now. That's what matters." There were no confessions of love. No dramatic proposals, no fairy tale, just presence. And in a world that's loud and cruel and always rushing past the quiet people, sometimes presence is the most radical act of love there is. By the time October rolled around, Everett Langston was fading. His hands, once strong enough to build fences and hold newborns, now trembled when lifting a spoon. His voice, once thunderous in business meetings, now cracked with every whisper. Even his pride, the thing he'd clung to longer than his health, had started slipping. He didn't argue anymore when Ruth changed his shirt. He didn't pretend not to cry when she helped him out of the bath. And when the pain came hard and fast, he didn't try to hide it. He just looked at her. And she stayed. One night, just after dinner, Ruth helped him into his favorite chair by the window. The air smelled like rain and falling leaves. The streetlight flickered outside, casting soft gold across his thinning hair. He stared out for a while, then said, "Ruth, can you sit with me for a bit?" She did. They didn't talk for a long time. Everett just listened to the wind, watched the shadows on the sidewalk, watched Ruth's reflection in the window beside his own, the way her hands folded in her lap, calm and sure. Then, without turning his head, he said it. "I want to marry you." Ruth blinked. She thought maybe the morphine was playing tricks on him. Maybe he meant something else, but his voice was steady. "You don't have to love me," he said. "This isn't about that. I'm not asking for romance." She didn't answer, so he kept going, slowly. "I'm asking because you've been the only person in my life who showed up when no one else would. You didn't walk away, even when I gave you every reason to." His breath was short, but he pushed through. "My kids, they're not gonna care that I'm gone, but they'll care about what I leave behind. And I'm not giving it to people who only show up after the will gets read." He turned to face her now, eyes glassy but sharp. "You earned it, Ruth, every day for 21 years. The room fell silent again. All that could be heard was the soft tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of a neighbor's TV. Ruth looked down at her hands. People already thought she was manipulating him. already assumed she was stealing, already believed she was counting the minutes until he died and left her something. If she said yes, the whispers would turn into screams, into lawsuits, into headlines, and yet she also knew what was true. She had been there. She had held him through his worst. And if he wanted his name, his legacy, to be entrusted to someone who actually gave a damn about him, then wasn't that his right? "I'm not asking for a big show," Everett said softly. "No dress, no rings. Just something official, legal." Ruth's throat was tight. "Why now?" He looked out the window again. "Because I don't want to leave this world with everything undone, and if I die tomorrow, I want it to be knowing I put things in the hands of someone who won't waste it, someone who won't forget me." She swallowed hard. "Everett, people are going to say I used you." He smiled for the first time all night. "Let them talk. They never did a damn thing for me." "You did." 3 days later, they got married in the backyard. No flowers, no guests. Just Reverend Elijah Monroe from down the street, the family lawyer Marla Green, and 2 old neighbors to witness. Ruth wore a plain white dress she found at a thrift store. Everett wore a suit he hadn't touched since Rose's funeral. It hung loose on his thinning frame, but he insisted on wearing it. The wind rustled the garden trees, the sun warmed the porch, and as the vows were read, Everett closed his eyes, not from weakness, but from peace. He didn't hold Ruth's hand. He couldn't lift it. But she held his. The neighbors laughed behind their curtains. She married him for the money. What a scam. He probably didn't even know what he was signing. Ruth heard every word and ignored everyone, because that ceremony wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about closure, about giving a dying man the dignity of knowing that what he built wouldn't fall into the hands of people who forgot how to love him. 6 days later, Everett Langston died in his sleep. No pain, no noise. Just a slow fading, like the end of a song only he could hear. Ruth found him at sunrise, still in bed, hand resting on his chest like he was finally at ease. She didn't scream. She didn't sob. She sat beside him, wrapped his cold fingers in hers, and whispered, "You kept your promise. Now I'll keep mine." The wedding didn't make the front page. It didn't even make the back. No photographer, no string quartet. No reception. Just a dying man in a borrowed suit, and a woman who'd spent 2 decades choosing presence over recognition. They stood in the backyard, surrounded by weeds and memories, as Reverend Elijah Monroe read the vows. Ruth Delaney kept her eyes on Everett Langston, not because he looked well, he didn't, but because he looked at peace. For once, the weight in his chest wasn't just physical. It was a letting go. He could barely sit up by then. Ruth had tucked a small pillow behind his back. His skin was pale, his body gaunt. But his eyes, they still had fight, still had something to say. When Reverend Monroe asked him if he took Ruth to be his lawful wife, Everett gave a small nod and managed one word. "Yes." Ruth answered the same, her voice steady despite the storm brewing behind her ribs. They didn't kiss. He was too weak to even hold her hand, but she held his. That was enough. After the ceremony, Marla Green, Everett's longtime attorney, notarized the marriage license on the porch railing. The 2 neighbors signed as witnesses, trying not to look too curious. And that was it. No toast, no music. Just the wind rustling through the garden and a wheelchair facing the late afternoon sun. That night, Ruth helped Everett into bed like she always did. She fluffed his pillow, adjusted the oxygen, smoothed his blanket. He didn't say much, just squeezed her hand before his eyes slipped closed. She stayed by his side for hours, holding that hand long after it had gone cold. When dawn came, she was still there. Still holding on, but Everett was gone. The funeral was private. No children came, no flowers sent, no calls. Reverend Monroe read Psalm 23 under a grey sky, while Ruth stood beneath an umbrella she didn't need. Her face didn't crack. Her voice didn't tremble. She had already grieved the man years ago. This was just honoring the last page. 3 days later, Marla Green called Everett's children. Their numbers were still on file. Surprisingly, all still active. She left voicemails, sent emails, texted. It took 2 more days before anyone responded. When they did, it wasn't gentle. Eric Langston, the eldest, texted back one line. "What does she want?" Vanessa Langston replied with, "Guess the maid finally got her payday." Derek Langston didn't respond at all. Only Claire Langston said, "I'll come." Marla didn't argue. She simply confirmed the will reading and set a date. They flew in from all over. Eric from Chicago, stiff and sullen. Vanessa from Oregon, wearing designer sunglasses and an attitude. Derek from Atlanta, accompanied by a woman no one recognized and didn't bother introducing. Claire from Charleston, alone. They met in the old house they had abandoned decades ago, now still and spotless thanks to Ruth. Ruth stayed quiet, seated in the corner of the room in a simple black dress, not as the help, not as the wife seeking validation. Just present. Marla opened the folder and cleared her throat. This will was signed 12 days before Mr. Langston passed. I've served as his legal counsel for over 20 years. Everything in here is final and binding. Eric rolled his eyes. Let's just get to the money part. Vanessa chewed her gum, like it owed her something. Marla read, "To my children, Eric, Vanessa, Derek, and Claire. I leave each of you $1. The room froze. Claire's eyes widened. Derek leaned forward. Vanessa actually laughed. Eric turned red. This is not out of anger, Marla continued, but out of fairness. You chose to leave my life. I now choose to leave you out of my death. Derek stood up. This is a joke, Vanessa barked a laugh. $1? That's petty, even for him. Claire said nothing. Eric looked at Ruth for the first time that day, eyes narrowed. What did you say to him? Ruth didn't respond. She didn't need to. Marla turned the page. The remainder of my estate, including this house, all personal belongings, retirement accounts, stocks, shares, and business holdings, I leave in full to my wife, Ruth Delaney Langston. Silence dropped into the room like a hammer. Vanessa's purse hit the floor. Derek cursed under his breath. Eric stood, pacing. Claire stared at the table, then slowly looked up at Ruth. $23 million, Marla said quietly, was Mr. Langston's net worth at the time of death. Vanessa screamed. Eric demanded a recount. Derek accused Ruth of fraud. Claire simply whispered, he meant it. Ruth sat still, no gloating. No anger, just hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't expected it, but she honored it. Marla closed the folder. You're welcome to contest the will, she said calmly, but it's valid, and so is the marriage. You will lose. The room stayed frozen, not out of shock, out of pride cracking beneath the surface. The people who had walked away were now faced with the truth. They weren't forgotten. They were excluded. By choice. After the children stormed out, some fuming, some speechless. Ruth remained. She sat there for a long time after the door slammed shut, listening to the house breathe again. She hadn't won anything. She had simply outlasted the pain. By the time the Langston children left the house that day, the storm had already begun to gather. Eric was the first to speak to the press. He stood outside the gates of his father's estate, with his sleeves rolled up and rage bubbling under every word. She manipulated a dying man. That woman has no right to carry our family name. The cameras ate it up. Vanessa wasn't far behind. She launched a podcast that same week called White Wealth Theft. In the first episode, she accused Ruth of being a predator in scrubs, who climbed the ladder one sponge bath at a time. It got 800 downloads, then 400, then 12. Even her friends stopped listening. Derek filed for bankruptcy before he could do a single interview. He vanished a week later, no goodbye. No email, no trace. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe it was easier to disappear than to face the truth that someone he had dismissed had done what he never could. But the real fury didn't come from the family, it came from the town, from the neighbors who never waved at Ruth, from the pharmacy clerk who whispered behind the counter, from the grocery store cashier who muttered under her breath, "Bet she used voodoo." The comments rolled in fast. Gold digger. Scammer. She planned it all. He was senile, she took advantage. People crossed the street when Ruth walked by. They stopped inviting her to church. One woman posted a photo of Ruth outside the post office and captioned it, "The face of manipulation." The internet had its opinions too. Reddit threads called her the widow who hustled. One TikTok claimed to have proof she forged the will. It was a screenshot of a blurry legal form with her name circled in red. Twitter got worse. Ruth didn't have a Twitter, but that didn't stop the hashtags from trending. Langston Lute, nurse to wife to millionaire Marsh justice for the real family. She turned off the TV, unplugged the computer, stopped reading the mail after someone sent an envelope filled with ash and a note that read, "Burn in hell." But Ruth didn't fight back. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't go on Dr. Phil. She simply lived. Each morning, she watered the garden Everett had planted years ago. The tomatoes were doing well that summer. The rosemary was overgrown but still fragrant. She hired a contractor to fix the broken porch steps. She kept Everett's favorite chair by the window. She cooked breakfast at the same time every day, even if there was no one to eat it but her. Because grief has no schedule. And dignity needs no audience. The only one who came back was Claire. She knocked on the front door one afternoon, no makeup, a wrinkled sweater hanging off her frame. Ruth answered. Claire's voice cracked before she could even get the words out. "I lost everything," she said. "I was so mad for so long, but I just want to talk. Not about the money, about him." Ruth stepped aside. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. No lawyers, no cameras. Just two women and the ghosts they carried. Claire talked for hours about the man her father used to be. The man he became, and the man Ruth helped him die a softer, kinder, willing to say sorry. She asked questions. She cried, she listened, and Ruth, for the first time in weeks, let herself speak freely. "He loved you," she said. "He didn't know how to show it, but he never stopped." Claire looked down, voice barely audible. "I wish I'd come back sooner." Ruth nodded. "I wish he'd asked you to." The next day, Claire returned. She brought old photos. They laughed at Everett's awful sweaters. They remembered how he used to insist he could fix the toaster himself, even after 3 sparks and 1 minor kitchen fire. And slowly, without saying it, they started to heal. Not all wounds close with apologies. Some just need to be acknowledged. Still, Ruth gave no money to the children. Not a dime. But she gave something else a chance to look at themselves, to reckon with what they'd abandoned, to decide who they wanted to be going forward. She wasn't interested in revenge. She wasn't interested in guilt, only growth. Behind closed doors, she had created a clause in the will, quiet, private, not legally binding but spiritually unshakable. A portion of Everett's wealth would go toward helping his children, but only if Ruth saw real change. Not performative regret, not fake forgiveness. Actual transformation. Claire was the first to earn that. Ruth helped her pay off student loans, connected her with a counselor, introduced her to a non-profit board for women with grief trauma. not as charity, but as a bridge. One Claire had finally learned how to cross. The house got quieter after Claire started visiting. Not because people stopped talking far from it, but because Ruth stopped listening. Outside her garden gate, the world continued to speculate. Inside, she planted new herbs, cleaned the windows, replaced the leaky faucet Everett never got around to fixing. But the peace wouldn't last. Eric Langston had filed a lawsuit. It arrived on a Thursday. A courier in a wrinkled shirt handed Ruth the envelope without a word, like he didn't want to be part of whatever this was. The papers were thick, filled with legal jargon and cold accusations. Undue influence, fraud, emotional manipulation. Eric claimed Ruth had coerced a mentally deteriorating man into rewriting his will. He said Everett had been not of sound mind, said Ruth had infiltrated the household for personal gain. The language was venom in a suit. Ruth read every word. Then she called Marla Green. Marla had expected this. "Let them try," she said. They met in court 2 months later. Eric wore a dark blue tie, the same color his father used to wear on Sundays. His lawyer spoke for him, loudly, confidently, and with zero evidence. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes and no patience for theatrics, asked one question. "Do you have proof?" They didn't. No doctor had declared Everett mentally unfit. No witness testified to any abuse. The marriage license was legal. The will was notarized. And Ruth didn't even take the stand. She didn't need to. Marla handled everything. The judge dismissed the case in 17 minutes. "Spite is not a legal strategy," she said flatly. Eric left red-faced and broke. Meanwhile, Vanessa Langston doubled down. Her podcast, White Wealth Theft, pivoted from rant to crusade. She booked herself on small AM radio shows, church panels, even a YouTube talk series with 12 subscribers. She painted herself as a whistleblower, claimed Ruth was part of a national scheme of caregivers targeting lonely white widowers. "Reverse racism," she said. Cultural hijacking. Her voice was tight. Her facts were thin. Her audience was shrinking. Even her co-host, a former college roommate, quit mid-episode. "Maybe your father just made his own choice," she said, before slamming her laptop shut. Vanessa never forgave her. By winter, Vanessa had moved to Oregon full-time, living in a rented cabin and recording episodes in a coat closet. The podcast dropped to 6 downloads a week. She still mentioned Ruth in every episode, still talked about legacy, betrayal, and bloodlines. But eventually, people stopped listening. The world moved on. Only she didn't. And then there was Derek, the quiet son. The one who smiled in old photos but never said much. The one who had brought a different woman to every family reunion and never once talked about love. Derek filed for bankruptcy 2 weeks after the will reading. He sold his car, closed his business, left his condo. No one heard from him again. Not Claire, not Vanessa, not even Eric. Some said he'd moved to Arizona. Others said he was living out of his truck. One person claimed to have seen him stocking shelves at a gas station near Tallahassee. Ruth didn't chase the rumors. Derek had always been a shadow in his own life. Now he had simply faded into the background. And through it all, Ruth remained. She didn't attend court, didn't respond to Vanessa's rants, didn't post a single word online. She got up, made breakfast, took her tea by the window. Sometimes she read Everett's old books. Sometimes she just watched the rain. Not because she was unbothered, but because she'd already survived worse. 21 years of whispers, of looks, of people treating her like she didn't belong in the house she cleaned, the room she slept in, the chair she now owned. She had nothing left to prove. One Sunday, as she swept the porch, a neighbor walked by. The same one who used to say, "Morning, Miss Delaney," with a fake smile and a stiff nod. This time, she didn't speak. She just crossed the street. Ruth swept anyway. That evening, Claire called. I don't know how you do it, she said. Ruth chuckled. Because I know who I am. Claire was quiet for a moment. I used to hate you. I know. I thought you took something from me. I know that too. Another pause. But you didn't. Ruth's voice softened. No. I gave something back. Because she had. Not money, not inheritance. But truth. She had shown them who their father really was at the end. Not the angry man who broke them, but the man who tried too late, but sincerely, to make things right. That mattered. It didn't fix the past, but it honored it. Ruth Delaney never flashed her wealth. She didn't buy a new car, didn't travel to Paris, didn't redecorate the house Everett had left her. In fact, she kept everything just about the same. Same creaky porch, same faded curtains, same flower beds Everett had once planted with trembling hands and a half-hearted grin. People noticed. Strange, one neighbor said. If I got $23 million, I wouldn't be living like that. But Ruth wasn't interested in proving anything. Not to them, not to anyone. She knew what they were really asking. Why wasn't she playing the role they expected her to play? Some had already written her off. They expected her to run off with the money, to buy a mansion, to change her name and pretend she'd never been a caregiver. But Ruth didn't run. She stayed. And slowly, she began using Everett Langston's fortune, not for revenge, not for applause, but for healing. The first thing she did was fix the roof. Not because it leaked, but because Everett had worried about it for years, and she wanted to silence that ghost once and for all. Then she paid off the medical bills still lingering in his name. Every last one. She didn't have to. But she remembered how embarrassed Everett had been every time another envelope came through the door marked Final Notice. Dignity mattered. Even after death. After that, she called up a local scholarship foundation. She didn't want a building named after her. No plaques, no gala dinners. She just wanted to create something quiet and real. So she funded tuition for 3 kids from the neighborhood, all of them caregivers for sick parents or grandparents, all of them overlooked. She met them for coffee, one by one, listened to their stories, offered advice when they asked, and never told them how much money she gave, because what she really gave was possibility. Next, she turned to something closer to home. She used a portion of the inheritance to create a caregiver resource center in Norfolk, just a small brick building near the bus line with soft lighting and wide hallways, no marble counters, no tech startup hype. Just beds for overnight respite care, support groups, free counseling, workshops on how to manage grief when you're still wiping mouths and folding laundry. She called it the Hawthorne House, not after Everett's wealth, but after the man he became in his final days. The man who finally said thank you. The man who finally asked for help. The man who finally let someone in. And still, the questions came. When are you going to give the kids their share? Don't you think it's time? Even just a little? But Ruth didn't budge, because Everett's will hadn't been just a document. It had been a statement. They chose to leave me. I now choose to leave them out of my death. But Ruth, she had left the door open. She never promised money. What she offered was far more difficult to accept, a chance to change. To face themselves, to do the hard work, to grow. She created private trust accounts for each child. The terms were simple, yet firm. No disbursements unless Ruth personally approved them. No cash handouts. Only support for things that proved change. Tuition, therapy, debt repayment tied to recovery. Claire was the first to qualify, not because she begged, but because she showed up, again and again, with apologies, with stories, with honesty. She began volunteering at the Hawthorne House twice a week, brought in cookies, listened to caregivers cry in the break room, She didn't ask for a check. She just came. And that's when Ruth helped her, paid off her student debt, helped her move into a small home near the coast, connected her with a non-profit working on mental health outreach, and never once made her feel like she owed a thank you card. Eric never came back. Not once. Vanessa kept recording her podcast, though it had dipped to under 10 listeners per episode. She sent Ruth a cease and desist letter. Ruth placed it, unopened, in a drawer and made herself a cup of tea. As for Derek, no one knew where he'd gone. But Ruth had a feeling she'd hear from him one day. When the silence got too heavy, when the truth grew louder than the shame, people started to notice. Not the media, not the gossipers, but the ones who mattered. The nurses who slipped into the caregiver center on their lunch break just to breathe. The single father who used the counseling services to finally process losing his mother. The teenager who hadn't planned to finish high school but now wanted to become a hospice nurse. Ruth didn't speak at fundraisers. She didn't take photos with giant checks, but her presence filled rooms in a way no fortune ever could. One evening, as she watered the tomatoes in the back garden, Claire sat beside her with a cup of coffee. They watched the sunset without speaking. Then Claire asked softly, "Do you think they'll ever come around?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She dug her fingers into the soil, felt the roots, the damp earth, the quiet life still growing beneath the surface. Then she said, "Maybe, but even if they don't, I did what I was supposed to do." Claire Langston never expected to come back. Not to the house, not to Ruth, not to the memory of her father that lingered in every creaking floorboard. But she did, and each time she returned, she stayed a little longer. At first, it was awkward. The silence between her and Ruth felt like walking through a field of thorns, careful, deliberate, tense. But over time, the silences softened, turned into shared glances, into small jokes, into something like trust. Claire started helping out at the Hawthorne House, Ruth's caregiver center. At first, she just folded laundry and cleaned out storage rooms. Then she started sitting in on grief group sessions. Then she began talking slowly, quietly, about what it was like to lose someone before they died. What it was like to grieve a man while he was still in the room. People listened. They didn't care that her last name was Langston. They cared that she understood, and in helping others name their pain, Claire began to heal her own. One day, Ruth handed Claire an envelope. Inside was a check, a large one. Claire stared at it. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," Ruth said. "That's why it's yours." Claire blinked back tears. "You sure?" Ruth nodded. "You earned this the same way I did, by showing up when it counted. It wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about blood. It was about accountability. Consistency. Heart. The other Langstons never came around. Eric vanished after his failed lawsuit. Rumor had it he was living with a cousin in Cleveland, applying for loans he couldn't get approved for. He sent one more email, angry, scathing, accusing Ruth of everything from manipulation to witchcraft. She never replied. She didn't have to. Vanessa kept her podcast alive, though even she seemed tired of her own voice. By her 50th episode, she was ranting into the void, defending a father she hadn't called in 3 decades. At one point, she asked her audience, "Wouldn't you be mad if your dad left everything to the help?" Only 2 people responded. Both said no. The podcast quietly stopped uploading after that. Derek remained a ghost. No postcards. No sightings, no lawsuits, just an absence that took up space. Ruth never stopped hoping he'd find peace, but she also knew some people choose to disappear rather than confront the mirror, and that was a decision only he could make. In the meantime, Ruth focused on what she could control. She restructured Everett's portfolio, liquidated stocks he'd always said were too flashy, used the money to expand the center, add new therapy rooms, and fund a 24-hour caregiver hotline. She didn't need her name in lights, but she wanted his name to mean something again, not wealth, not gossip, but service. The town began to change too. People who once whispered started waving again. The same neighbor who crossed the street to avoid her one summer later dropped off tomato seeds for the garden. A grocery clerk who once rolled her eyes now asked about volunteer shifts. Change didn't happen all at once, but it happened, because consistency is louder than scandal. And kindness quiet, stubborn kindness is impossible to ignore forever. One afternoon, Ruth stood in Everett's old study, staring at a dusty bookshelf. She pulled out a leather notebook, one she hadn't noticed before. Inside was Everett's handwriting, shaky but legible. It wasn't a journal. It was a list. Things I want to make right. She read each line slowly. Call Claire. Apologize to Derek. Fix the roof. Make peace with my children, even if it's too late. Tell Ruth she saved me. At the bottom in smudged ink, don't die bitter. Don't die like my father. Ruth closed the book and held it to her chest. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "You didn't." Claire found her in the garden later that evening. Thinking about him? Always. Claire sat down beside her. He was never perfect. No, Ruth said, but neither were we. They watched the sky bleed into orange and purple. Then Claire asked, "Do you think he was proud of me at the end?" Ruth turned to her and said, "I think he would have been proud of the woman you are now." Claire smiled softly. That's enough. The next morning, Ruth drafted a letter. It wasn't to the press, or the Langstons, or a legal team. It was to the future trustee of the Hawthorne House, for after she was gone. In it, she laid out everything Everett had hoped for. Everything she'd witnessed, everything Claire had rebuilt, and one instruction: protect the peace we fought for. Not the property, not the portfolio, the peace. That's what this place was always meant to carry. She signed it simply. Ruth Delaney Langston. Caregiver. Wife. Keeper of the quiet. When people asked Ruth Delaney what she did with the money, she always gave the same answer. I bought peace. They'd laugh, thinking she was being coy. But she wasn't joking. She meant it. She didn't buy yachts or designer clothes. Didn't fly to Italy or hire a private chef. Instead, she bought insulation for the old windows. She bought textbooks for local students. She bought cots for caregivers who needed one night of uninterrupted sleep. And in return, she bought something most people spend their whole lives chasing: a quiet heart. The neighborhood finally stopped whispering. The shock wore off. The lawsuits failed. The rumors got old. People moved on, and those who stayed began to see her differently. The woman who once carried groceries in silence now ran the most respected non-profit in the county. The woman they called a gold digger was now Mrs. Langston at town council meetings. The woman who was invisible for 21 years had become unforgettable. But Ruth didn't need the recognition. She didn't build her life for applause. She built it for meaning. Claire continued to grow. She enrolled in a part-time counseling program paid for entirely by Ruth, started leading workshops at the Hawthorne House, helped create a grief curriculum for adult children with estranged parents. One evening, after a support group, she turned to Ruth and said, "Do you think they'll ever understand? My brothers..." "Vanessa," Ruth shook her head slowly, "understanding takes humility, and not everyone's ready for that." Claire nodded. "Then I'm grateful I got there first." As for the others, Eric never reached out again. His name occasionally showed up on political mailing lists and business expos, but he remained absent. More echo than man, Vanessa kept her podcast running for another year. The last episode was titled, "They Took Him From Me." It had 5 downloads. She deleted the account a week later. Derek stayed missing, but Ruth left his trust untouched, just in case. She believed people could still return from the shadows, even if they took the long way home. One rainy afternoon, Ruth sat alone in the garden. Everett's garden. The rosemary had taken over again. The tomatoes were gone for the season, but the soil was still warm. She sat with her tea, watching the steam curl upward like memory. That's when a young girl walked through the gate, maybe 17, maybe 18. Skinny, nervous, holding a worn envelope. "Are you Mrs. Langston?" Ruth nodded.
The girl handed her the envelope, hands shaking. "I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" "You paid for my nursing exam. You don't know me."
"But I just passed." Ruth smiled. "Yes, I do know you," she said. "You're one of mine." Later that night, Ruth stood in Everett's old study, now converted into a quiet library. Books lined the walls. Photos of caregivers and patients sat on the shelves. She lit a single candle. Not for grief, for remembrance, and whispered into the stillness, "You didn't die bitter, Everett. You died with someone holding your hand. You died seen." The town changed, a little. People asked more questions, listened more carefully, volunteered more often. And every time someone passed by that weathered house with the creaky porch and the clean windows, they paused. Not because it was beautiful, but because it had become something sacred. A place where redemption was planted. A place where someone dared to love without reward. A place where legacy was rewritten not in courts, but in compassion. Years later, when Ruth finally passed, it wasn't sudden. She was 78, at home, in her favorite chair. Wrapped in the same blanket Everett once called too ugly to throw away. Claire found her in the morning, still holding a photo of the garden. The obituary was short and simple. Ruth Delaney Langston, caregiver, community leader, wife. Survived by countless lives she helped rebuild. At the funeral, there were no spotlights, no headlines. Just a long line of people waiting to say thank you. Nurses, janitors, single mums, widowed men, college kids who never met her but felt her fingerprints on every opportunity they'd been given. Claire gave the eulogy. She didn't raise her voice, she said, but somehow she still managed to be heard. Back at the house, everything remained. The porch swing, the wild rosemary, the candle in the study, now placed in a glass case. A plaque outside read, "You don't have to be blood to be family, and love doesn't always come in the package you expect, but when it's real, it leaves something behind even after it's gone." That was Ruth's legacy. Not the millions she protected, not the mansion she never bought, not the last name she married into, but the truth she lived every day, that dignity doesn't need permission, and peace is a wealth no one can steal. You don't have to be blood to be family, and you don't need a crowd to matter. There's something Ruth Langston taught us not through speeches, but through presence. In a world that often chases recognition, she chose dignity. In a society that values loud ambition, she chose quiet service. She didn't inherit wealth, she earned peace, and maybe that's the real takeaway. Legacy isn't just about who remembers your name. It's about how people feel in the spaces you once occupied. Did you bring comfort? Did you leave something better than you found it? For those of us in our later years, this isn't just a story, it's a reminder. It's never too late to make something meaningful. You don't need applause to do something extraordinary. You just need to keep showing up with love, with humility, with grace. Because in the end, the richest lives aren't the loudest. They're the ones lived gently and remembered deeply.